Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith, Photography the Great. Today we're going to be doing a little tutorial on flash. I am going to do several videos following this one, and we're going to go into more and more detail. It's going to take a few videos because flash is kind of a broad subject. I figured though, as I started thinking about tutorial ideas, flash made a lot of sense because I use a lot of flash in my own photography, and flash is probably one of the most misunderstood aspects of photography in my opinion. I've got my SB900 flash and D700 that I'm going to be using here as an example today. But as time goes on, we're going to talk about the other Nikon speedlights as well. We'll talk about the SB700 and the 800 as well as the 910. One of the areas where I notice people really getting stuck is just getting stuck on using natural light. There's certainly not anything wrong with using natural light. As a matter of fact, as you find yourself using a lot more flash, you will actually find that you end up getting more and more proficient with natural light as well. Because as you get accustomed to creating light and shaping light, you'll also become more aware of light in general. And you'll be more aware of those situations where the light that nature has provided or the environment has provided is, just going to be the best way to go. This video is kind of going to be made assuming that you're already very familiar with the manual settings on your camera. I always recommend that once you really get over into using flash, you really want to be using the manual mode on your camera. So you really need to be familiar with ISO, shutter speed, and aperture already. So if you guys are still kind of getting accustomed to those settings, definitely look at my other videos on that. And yeah, because this video is going to be assuming that you already know that. You really need to be using the full manual mode whenever you really get into using flash. Now, go ahead and repeat that just because, it's that important. As you guys will see, those settings are going to affect what happens with your flash a little bit differently than what happens whenever you're using natural light. So do keep that in mind as we look at this in more detail. Before we get to more interesting things, I'm going to show you guys a couple little small things to keep in mind about flashes. First thing, whenever you're storing your flashes, be sure to take the batteries out of the flash. The reason being is batteries left in flashes have a tendency to leak a lot. And yeah, that battery acid can get in your flash. It'll be totally ruined. And that's the last thing you want to do is ruin an expensive piece of equipment whenever you could have done something simple to prevent it, like take out the batteries. The next thing is, you don't want to use lithium batteries in a flash. Lithium batteries are very good for high-drain devices like compact digital cameras and other small items, but they don't do well in flashes because flashes actually draw a lot of power whenever they're recycling. The lithium batteries actually don't do so well with that. Whenever you use lithium batteries in a flash, you're only going to make your recycle times increase, and that's definitely not good whenever you're shooting. So you're much better off using alkaline batteries. Ideally though, you want to use some good rechargeable batteries like Sanyo Inner-Loops. Batteries like that actually are going to have the fastest recycle time, and the Sanyo Inner-Loop cells can also be stored for weeks, even months on end, and they don't self-discharge. So that's going to be the best way to go. More than likely, I'll be doing another video talking about batteries in the future. But until then, you can write me in the comments below if you have questions. Okay, so taking a look at the back of this Nikon SB900, the first thing I'm going to show you guys is how to change the modes. Nikon, they've given us an interface on all their latest flashes where it basically works like an old school cell phone. You have these different soft keys right here, and depending on where you are in the flash's menu system, the function of these buttons is actually going to change. So right now, I'm in TTL mode. This button right here actually acts as a flash exposure compensation here. But if I go over to something else, like for example if I go over to remote mode, then notice that it now is a button to allow us to change groups. We're actually going to get into the remote and master setting a bit later on, so just disregard that for now, but there will be a video in the next part we're going to be talking about that. So anyways, first up here, TTL mode. TTL is through the lens metering. It's an automatic mode. Basically the camera basically the flash monitors the f-stop and the ISO that you're using, but it also knows how far away your subject is, because it looks at where the lens is focused, and it takes that information into account as well whenever it adjusts its power settings. It also gets information from the camera's color meter, so lots and lots of information that the flash actually processes in that mode. Whenever you're using a Nikon flash, as I mentioned before, you're better off using the manual mode on your camera if you want the most control over your flash. One of the main reasons why is because if you are in a priority mode, like let's just say I was in program mode, for example, whenever I change the exposure compensation on my camera, it's going to affect how bright the flash is, and it's going to affect how bright the available light is. It's kind of a strange thing on Nikon. It's actually not that way on Canon, but yeah, really most of the time whenever you're changing something like that, having it change the ambient light and the flash brightness is kind of annoying. So usually manual is going to be the best way to go, but I'm going to show you more about that in a moment. So anyways, whenever you are in this mode, if you want to change just the brightness of the flash, you can press the flash exposure compensation button, and then you can go towards minus, or you can go towards plus. And of course, it's just like the exposure compensation on your camera, in the sense that after you get done making this adjustment, you want to put it back to 0, because wherever you have it set, it's going to stay. One other thing to keep in mind about that is you'll realize that your camera also has a flash exposure compensation setting. If you are using a external flash like this SP900, you don't want to use the flash exposure compensation setting on your camera. It's best just to go ahead and change it on the flash and leave the one on your camera alone. Okay, so going through the modes here, we'll hit the mode button again. Oh yes, and by the way, you'll notice that FP is on. That means that I have the high-speed sync turned on my camera. And I'm going to show you guys what that does in a second too. Okay, the next thing that we have is an aperture-based auto mode. This is like the auto mode that flashes used to have. This is not a TTL auto mode. Basically, instead of knowing how far away your subject is based off distance information from the lens, the flash simply monitors how much light gets reflected back off the subject. And it just has a little sensor that's right up there. So basically the flash works like the old school thyristor type flashes in this mode. I can't think of any reason why you'd use that these days. Then we have guide number based automatic. It's basically like a distance priority, if you will. Basically what happens is, whenever you're shooting with a flash, your shutter speed doesn't change how bright the flash is, and it doesn't change how far the flash can go. However, the power of the flash affects that, the f-stop affects that, and the ISO affects that. So depending on how you're shooting, like if you're shooting in an event and you're changing your f-stop a lot to affect your depth of field, what this mode does is, ordinarily if you were in like full manual, which we're going to get to in a moment, anytime you go to a higher f number, you would have to up the power of your flash. But what this mode does is, this mode allows you to set a distance that you want the flash to be able to fire at, and then the flash keeps on compensating for it even whenever you change your f-stop. So let's see, if we get a closer look at this, okay, what's going to happen here is, okay, you can see I can hit this right here, which allows me to change my feet. So let's just say that I knew my subject was 12 feet away. As I change my f-stop, what's going to happen is the flash is going to maintain that distance. Now, whenever I start opening up my lens, I'm going to show you guys what happens here. Okay, we're going to go down to a foot here. But yeah, whenever I start opening up my lens, notice that the minimum distance that I can attain decreases a little bit because the flash can only dial down so far. The same thing would happen if I were to raise my ISO. Actually, you can see my ISO changing there on my flash screen. Notice that whenever I start raising my ISO, see how that bar is increasing? It's basically telling me that I can't attain the same minimum distance that I normally can, because by raising the ISO, I am making my exposure more sensitive to the presence of the flash, and so the flash can't dial back far enough. But once you have the settings at something neutral, like say for example if you were just at 200 ISO, as I go in here and adjust my f-stop, even when I go to a higher f number, the flash is going to increase its power. And of course that only works up to a point. If I stopped way down, like to f22 in this case, obviously it's not going to work because the flash is not going to be able to put out enough power to go a very, very great distance. So see how right here, whenever I start going past about 4 feet, notice that it's saying, hey, that's not going to work. But if I decrease the f number, I can now attain a higher maximum. Or vice versa, if I were to increase my ISO, I could also attain a higher maximum distance on the flash. So that's basically how that works. A lot of people like this mode. I personally like using this next mode if I require more control. I mostly just like using this manual mode. This is very, very straightforward because it just simply allows you to set the power of the flash. Pretty straightforward here. M for manual, change this. The lowest flash power is going to be the smaller fractions, so like 1 over 128 is going to be this, a very low output, whereas 1 over 1 is going to be full power. And you can see how my distance is being affected there. So as I start decreasing the power of the flash, the distance starts to decrease. As I increase the power of the flash, the distance increases. And the whole thing about f-stop and ISO applies here as well. If I go down to a wider aperture, the distance of the flash increases. If I go to a smaller aperture, the distance of the flash decreases. And then once again, it's going to be the exact same thing with ISO. If I go up to a higher ISO, camera is now more sensitive to light, flash is going to go further. If I go to a lower ISO, the camera is not as sensitive to light, and the flash is going to go a shorter distance. So I find that to actually be very, very intuitive if I require more manual control. And basically, the manual flash mode, with TTO there is going to be a little bit of variation because every single time that you go in and every time you go in and take another exposure, the flash is going to be remetering the scene. And so in TTO you may see a little bit of variation. If you're shooting in a situation where there's not a lot of variables, where your ambient light is not changing drastically, that's going to be a good case for TTO. So if you're doing like say for example you're shooting at an event and you're doing more of a photo booth type setup, or if everyone is going to be posed in a particular spot at a fixed distance from you, then going manual can be a good way to go because you're going to get the maximum amount of consistency. Alrighty. Repeating mode is basically a way to tell the flash to fire a certain amount of times at a certain frequency. And you typically do this during a long exposure shot. It kind of gives you a double exposure effect. So you'll see this in a lot of people, a lot of photographs where people have done action photos and they've got like a dancer or something in different positions in the frame in one shot, that sort of thing. Not something that I use a whole lot, but it's definitely kind of cool. We may actually make a video talking about just that mode by itself sometime in the future. Now we're back to TTL. Of course, now we have TTL, and then we have the letters BL up here. TTL BL is balanced TTL. Basically, it's used for fill flash. If you're in a situation where you have a bright background and you just want your, you basically just need a little bit of flash to kind of lighten up the subject, like if you have someone sitting in front of a bright window or something like that, basically that's where TTL BL comes in. The flash is not going to be the primary source of light in the shot. It's just going to fire just enough to fill in the shadows a little bit. Okay, and then we hit that again. We're back to the standard TTL mode once again.